If you've got a production of milk from your cow, you can put it in a bucket and store it and then drink it later. Electricity can't be stored directly. That's one of the dilemmas of energy storage. Different kinds of storage assets are going to be needed and are needed. The unique part of our technology is that we do this via repurposing a legacy mine shaft. There is huge quantities of land, often in very attractive areas, that are sitting in doing nothing. It's a really simple example of using gravity for great effect to store energy and at the same time taking that redundant asset and making it do work again for the energy transition.
That is Mark Swinnerton, CEO of Green Gravity, based in Wollongong, Australia. Mark began his career in metallurgy and has spent 2 decades in the resources industry supporting global mining operations. He is now tackling the ongoing challenges of legacy mines and the increasing need for better renewable energy storage through his company Green Gravity, which aims to repurpose the abundance of disused mines around the world to house gravitational storage and bridge downtime in renewable energy supply in a cost-effective, automated, and sustainable way. My name is Peter Marcus Bach, and this is the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to tackle the global challenges that our world is facing in their own unique ways. We reflect on the many out-of-the-box ways our guests have navigated the complexity and intricacies of the environment at the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. On today's show, Mark shares his incredible multi-decadal experience of the mining industry and the numerous future challenges that it faces. We discuss the increasing importance of storage technology in a world where renewable energy is becoming commonplace, and gain insight into how he is giving abandoned mines a new lease on life, and how Green Gravity is supporting countries in the sustainable energy transition. Detailed information is provided in the show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the show. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Peter. Thanks for the invite. And we're multi-continental today. So
we definitely are multi-continental.
It's really a great pleasure.
And you're the first person from Wollongong, Australia, to be on the show.
Excellent.
If you Google it, you see lots of beautiful pictures of the coastline and beautiful sunny beaches. But you just mentioned that the temperature's done a full dip in contrast to here.
It has. We do have a few months of cooler, but the good news with Wollongong is beautifully positioned on the coast. As you said, it's a very coastal town. It's actually hedged in by a huge cliff. And so it's an unusual place where you really can't get far from the beach. So that does keep the temperatures kind of within a band, being right on the coast. We don't get anything too cold. So we sort of get down to the low teens, perhaps in the middle of winter for a few weeks. So it's a wonderful place. And a great opportunity to be your first guest from Wollongong. And it's not a well-known place in Australia. However, we did host the World Cycling Championships year before last, which the UCI, so that it did put us on the map a little bit in some parts of Europe.
And if not that, then definitely the name, because that was my first impression when I first heard of the name back when I was a child at some point when I visited Australia. So
yeah, it's a catchy name. And actually the history of Wollongong, which has made it very amenable for us in Green Gravity, is it was very originally the earliest coal mining post sort of colonisation. It's the earliest coal mining footprint for Australia, particularly the northern part of Wollongong. They sort of all the suburbs and the train stations are named, the Black Gold Cafe or whatever it might be. So it's a very coal-rich area.
Oh, that's lovely. And that's a lot of keywords you mentioned. Green Gravity, you're CEO of Green Gravity, and going from coal mining to now what we're doing with all the mines as well. And those are some of the topics that I look forward to getting into in today's show. So lots of diverse topics and very interesting topics in the world of gravity being the key word that we're going to cover today. But one particular quirky aspect about you that I'd love to talk about first, and that was something I got to experience firsthand when you visited me in Switzerland last year, is your infamous selfie stick. Supposedly you really enjoy every time you meet someone, whether it's a stakeholder or just a good colleague, to take a selfie with them. And last time in Switzerland, you brought out this very fancy and very intricate selfie stick to do that. And listeners, you can just check out Mark's LinkedIn. He's got a lot of selfies from all his travels across the world. What's the story behind that, and what's the value of it to you?
Peter. And it is a fancy stick, and it is very interesting how few people actually can recognize a selfie stick on first pass. And so I get a lot of questions about what it is. And it's got functionality where you can take remote photos and you can do all these things. And the whole area stems back to a time prior to starting Green Gravity, where I was in a role, and we may talk about it later, I was in a role with BHP where we had a real need to hire huge numbers of people from the workforce and, from out there into the company. And one of the lessons I was schooled in quite quickly was what kind of posts in social media and in broader advertising media, what kind of posts attract people and what kinds of posts don't. Mm-hmm. And there was a really basic rule, and I teach it to our team regularly, which is posts involving people sell. Posts involving machines do not.
Uh-huh.
And it's amazing the kind of stats that sit around this when you test it. And so a selfie, a good selfie will poll 5 times the viewership of an amazing story or any kind of image that didn't involve people. It really is something. Social media is social. And so taking that theme into Green Gravity and realizing that, hey, we're going to be a small company with a small budget for marketing. How do we get a message into people's feeds, that people that really matter to our future? And part of that was, how do we get more people in? And so I sort of developed a habit of saying, well, a selfie is a great way of bringing multiple people in straight away every time. And it has a huge impact, and it really makes us get noticed. And so I've continued it.
It's very interesting to hear that, because, I think we read a few years ago that the word selfie actually made it into the dictionary because people were crazy about it. And you wouldn't think about it maybe 10, 20 years ago. You would have to find someone to take the picture for you. And I think I remember all the tours that I went on. It's like, oh, we want a picture. Okay, we need to find someone who can then do it for us.
Exactly. You need someone to. But if we take it to a business perspective, our click-through rate, so our engagement rate online, is nearly 10 times that of our competitors. And so we have got a very effective social media channel relative to our competitors, and we get all sorts of other anecdotes very regularly. We get people asking, can they get access to our marketing company, and or can they get access to how are we so successful in our marketing? And actually, we don't have a marketing company; we do it ourselves. But the selfie stick's an important element of that. It's a very high returning piece of investment.
I was going to say the biggest return on investment in the marketing expenses.
Exactly. Yeah, and also, one of the reflections is the ability in this day and age to target messaging to really very specific people. Social media offers that, and I think that's been a really effective for us, is that how do we find new customers, potential investors? This is one of the key methods that we do it, and we get their attention.
Indeed. And I think it's that more personal touch as well, because you're looking at the person, you're seeing the person for who they are. And I've heard of this research before where they looked at the personal space. So people appearing on online calls, for example, if the camera's too close, that's getting into that personal space. And there's a sweet spot of positioning the camera or positioning yourself from the camera that sort of evokes that connection as well.
Makes sense. The other thing we do in this area is we're pretty frequent and non-scripted. So it's more authentic, and it's, you make some mistakes along through that, of course, but the payback is greater to take those risks. And what it means is that people are getting an authentic journey of where your company's going. And many people are following it, and they know what we're doing. They know what we stand for. They know what our culture is, because they can see this kind of progressive messaging. And that makes a huge difference with our stakeholders. They kind of already know what we're doing, so we don't have to repeat that. We can really move forward quickly with them.
Usually it's about the person itself, building trust with who you're going to be working with, or who do you want to, I guess, work with. And especially in the environmental sector. And when you have to combine that with business, I think that becomes even more important, building that trust.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
So lots of variety of skills at play here, and lots of variety of topics at play here. But I guess let's go back to where it all started. Green Gravity, that's your startup in gravitational energy storage, and it uses abandoned mine sites or mine shafts across Australia and the world. But to get to that point, you began in metallurgy. You studied metallurgy at the University of Wollongong, and then, as you've already mentioned, spent quite a bit of time at BHP. You were also at BlueScope Steel at some point. So what motivated you to go into that field in the first place?
Well, my family came from a long line of engineers. My father was an engineer. His father was an engineer. And so I kind of was always grounded in the space of that was the direction I was always going to go. It was into some form of engineering or technical space. And I actually kind of liked civil. I liked buildings and bridges and so forth. And I thought my direction was that way. And I, at the end of school, was accepted into sort of civil engineering school in Melbourne. But my dad intervened actually and said, at the time, I'd also tried out for a scholarship with BHP, Australia's biggest company at the time. And I'd won this scholarship to go to Wollongong to do metallurgy. And it wasn't really on my agenda. And I sort of said, I prefer to do, I wanted to go into civils. And he kind of convinced me to say, well, you could go and use Dad's money to do civil engineering in Melbourne, or you could use BHP's money to go to Wollongong and do metallurgy. So maybe we should do that. And I did. I ended up taking that path, and it was a great steer. It got me into heavy industry, steel making, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the environment and learned a lot about the real world, be heavy industry and the real world of production shifts and that sort of stuff. And so I really got into that and enjoyed it, and spent many years working in steel mills and educating myself through metallurgy and Masters of Engineering after that to kind of enjoy the academia side, but actually most of that was really in the industrial setting. And that's how I got into it.
Yeah, and I guess motivated from the start with that very practical perspective through the education.
Yeah, exactly right.
And engineering in Australia is actually quite unique from what I heard from the rest of the world. I mean, I studied in Australia as well, and I did civil, but similar idea. I thought I was going to do mechatronics and ended up deciding on civil. And I think all the Lego I played with in my childhood kind of just steered me there without knowing. But yeah, I mean, it's a unique way of studying the discipline in Australia because they give you a more general overview in the first year, and then you start to specialize. And I guess in this case, you had that more industry-focused or that practice-oriented approach from the start as well.
Well, I actually did my university part-time and worked full-time in the steel mill and just did uni at night, by and large, the way the scheme worked. And so it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of get a few years of proper work experience up before others graduated. And so there was a cohort of us that did that. And actually, not long after graduating, a year or two after graduating, we had, in Australia, it's a very resource-focused kind of economy. And China in the early 2000s, China was just booming. And so Australia was seeing huge investment flows into commodities, particularly iron ore at the time. And so we took this opportunity. We had family had moved out to sort of the desert in Western Australia to the iron ore mines and took the opportunity to follow them out there. So moved out to Port Hedland in the sort of far northwest of Australia and spent a few years there, and kind of immediately kind of got out of my sort of pyrometallurgy space directly into sort of operations of mines and sort of hydrometallurgical kind of processing and so forth. So it's a very different kind of space out there and a totally different culture. It's a regional areas, it was fast moving, fast paced as people were investing to try and take advantage of the China boom.
That's you read my mind, because my next follow-up would have been, how did you go from metals to mining, other than the fact that that is one of the kinds of things you can mine, the ores for them. But yeah, I guess early 2000s, Australia had that big shift in culture because of the boom from China and all the investments. I remember when I was there, a lot of people were doing these fly-in, fly-outs or FIFOs, the way they call it. And yeah, you had a lot of mining towns sort of sprout up across the country, these, I guess, desert areas, but they really looked like fully functional, beautiful towns that you wouldn't mind staying in as well.
Very true. Yeah, and it was really it's always been a political, ever since that time, it's been a political issue in Australia, because a FIFO mine, in a way, invests but doesn't bring economic activity to the local region, because it sort of flies everything in and flies it out again, and people and goods and everything else. And so that's as opposed to people moving to the local community, buying or renting a house and being part of the community out there. And so there's this blend and tension between those two models, and that carries through today, particularly in Western Australia, in the northwest, and Queensland. Actually, Central Queensland's got a really big topic of this issue.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess it's still very much, front and center as part of the mining culture in Australia.
Yeah. But we were residential. So we moved up into the regional community in a small town of a few thousand people, and sort of lived as part of that community, which was a great privilege, and learnt a lot about that as well. It's the kind of experiences that can make a real difference to your perspective.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you make that decision and you commit to it, and then, you look back many years later and say, wow, okay, that really shaped, who I've become, and also your mindset as well. in a way, starting that scholarship from BHP and also being with BHP for a very long time. Actually, looking at your record, you've been there from 2002 all the way up to 2021.
It's true.
And vice president operations at some point as well.
Yeah. No, look, that's right. And in a company like that, you build a lot of experience by moving very diverse roles over time. So you can sort of stay within a global company and build diverse experience. And that kind of sets a culture, but it sets a skill base for you as well. And so my skill base certainly went through operational from junior to very senior operational roles, but also spent time in functional commercial areas as well, which was sort of helps round out for the broader business experience that can be very valuable.
Definitely. And you actually spent some time in Singapore. So a commonality that we share. I grew up in Singapore and you were there for 9 years from what it looks like.
Exactly. And no national service for me at all in Singapore. But yeah, I certainly... We moved from Western Australia out to Singapore as part of, again, it was all linked to what was going on in China, where there was this huge movement of iron ore out of Australia into Asia, and they needed more and more skills at being able to help that shipping and the commercial work. So I scored a job in Singapore working directly with the iron ore trading flows into Asia.
Oh, wow. I mean, when you think of the global material flows, it is quite massive to see just how much has to be shifted across countries, across borders, and then I guess the whole logistics behind that as well. So what better place to do it than Singapore? Major hub in Asia, but also a very fascinating city to live in.
Oh, exactly. And it really is where West meets East. And so you've got a mix of cultures. You've got logistically a very well-suited place. You can get to so many places from Singapore. So it's an ideal location to do business and to learn about international business because it's a real hub.
What were some of your more day-to-day highlights living in Singapore?
Well, you had this amazing sort of set of condos that they'd built over many years for expats that moved in there. So you had this metropolitan lifestyle with pools and beautiful infrastructure and so forth. So your day-to-day in Singapore is so different to what you might have in Australia or Switzerland, I feel, where it's kind of, you've got these high-end facilities, you've got this aspirational culture of, the restaurants and the entertainment districts and all these sorts of things. And we were, for most of our time there, pre-children. So, your life's different pre-children to post-children. And so it was a great location for that. And then, so our day-to-day was that and a lot of travel. We travelled a lot around all sorts of parts of Asia and South Asia and so forth. And then, of course, we had kids there and that changed our lifestyle. And, we've got everywhere with a pram and all these sorts of things after that. So it's hot in Singapore. That's the other thing people who haven't been there need to remember. It is hot when you go there, so be ready.
I mean, I lived there 16 and a half years. I don't miss it. I mean, in terms of the weather.
When we ultimately moved back to Australia, we moved to a place in winter, and I realised that after 9 years in Singapore, I no longer owned any warm clothing at all. I didn't have a jumper, to put on, and I got there. It was very cold. I had to urgently go find some clothing to buy.
A lot of these experiences I can definitely relate to. Having to buy a whole wardrobe when I first moved to Australia from Malaysia, actually. So you move from Singapore to Malaysia, it's not that big a difference, but then you move down quite a few latitudes, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, exactly.
But 9 years there, working with these massive responsibilities of, I guess, it would be millions, if not billions of dollars of materials, investments into the logistics as well. But what's it like being accountable for these very big decisions as part of a, I guess, multinational and very large mining company?
It's an interesting experience because you grow up with the numbers being very large in a company like that. And so when you get increases in your accountabilities, it's a normal thing. And therefore, what you're dealing with is numbers that are in the millions or the billions on a routine basis where, and therefore you're engaging with senior government or, some of the biggest organizations in the world as your day-to-day counterparts. And so you become very normalized to that. Saying that, you also have a knowledge that there's so much rigor needed to deal with those scales because a small mistake can have a very large consequence. And so one of the things you see is a lot of I think process or investment in capability that, if done well, becomes very efficient, but if done poorly, can become very bureaucratic. And so I think you've got to strike that balance between how do you be effective, but not overdo it on process at the same time.
I guess you want checks and balances, so you want to make sure they're in place, but then you want to take things fairly carefully, but also fairly systematic, so that you're confident in how you're operating.
Yeah, exactly right.
But you returned to Australia eventually, and still within your role as BHP. And I think by that stage, we also started to see another big emerging issue. And this is a topic we've discussed on the podcast before, which is really about abandoned mines, legacy issues, what happens once the mining operation finishes. And so, we've had that on episode 17 with Mo and Yeli Shetty, someone that we mutually know and are friends with. And I think it was close to that point where we then eventually also crossed paths for the first time as well. But what's your take, or what's from a very practical perspective, what is your experience and opinions about the challenges of mining legacy issues?
Well, just to enter into that, when I did come back to Australia for several years, I was in senior operational roles at mines throughout Australia. And I often reflect on this question around the legacy or the closure dimensions of mines, and how's that viewed from an operator's perspective or a leader's perspective within the operational mine. And it's something that is not high on the consciousness of operational management. Sure, if the mine's closing, it becomes more prominent, but preparing for closure a long way out, facilitating that process and optimizing it is not something that's a huge priority. And it never was when I was in sort of leadership roles. And so I reflect on that. It was very interesting. It's down the priority list. And so for people viewing it from another perspective, being they're in closure or they're dealing with closed assets, I guess proximity to that issue may make it appear like, of course, it should be a higher priority. Here's all this value sitting here and all these issues that should be resolved. But actually, from an operator's perspective, I'm not sure it will always get very high on the agenda until it's a clear and present issue. So I think that's a challenge for people working in the abandoned or legacy mining space, is how to make it relevant for operators, administrators, regulators of the mining sector.
Yeah. That's oftentimes far in the future. So, people tend to say we'll deal with it when it gets to the point of dealing with it. But these things have to often be incorporated into any plans for mining missions, if that's what you want to call it, or, plans to actually open a mine and operate it, right? Because life cycle planning, life cycle costing is important.
And I think increasingly this is really well recognised, and there's some good work being done in many areas around bringing it as early as possible in the planning processes, but also in the operating process. I mean, where you put your waste, how you deal with it progressively can make a big difference to what the final cost of remediation is. So there's actually a real incentive. And as the costs or expectations on remediation have grown, I think the opportunity cost of getting that operational phase wrong has grown as well. It's quite important now for mining operators to understand what that final closure plan actually looks like for their mine.
Yeah. And I guess also on the previous episode, we discussed different ways in which you can deal with post-mining operations, either, re-mining for critical minerals that we need, or repurposing the mines completely. And I guess as someone who's worked in that now and, running your own startup around the topic itself, or very much centered around this issue, how has this sort of shaped your thinking going from BHP to starting your own company?
Well, first, the scale is really interesting. And this is where Professor Mohan Yalashedi comes in. My first experience with yourself, actually, and Professor Yalashedi was around a shock event around understanding just how many of these legacy sites there are out there. And there's orders of magnitude more legacy sites than there are operating sites through the mining sector. There's literally millions of sites around the world. That is an important framing, because it says, all right, there's potentially issues associated with those sites. But more importantly, there is an enormous opportunity. There is huge quantities of land, often in very attractive areas, that are sitting in doing nothing. Yeah. And that is a really interesting issue. And we went and had a really good look at that when we started the company up. And I was shocked to find so many pieces of prime land in really interesting areas, urban areas, and having basically been ignored. And I find that really interesting that people haven't put more effort into how to repurpose these or found models to repurpose them. It's happening increasingly, but there's this untapped opportunity around the world in this area.
And in a way, that untapped opportunity, something to explore. And that's, I guess, what you seized as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is the key word that you mentioned at the start of the show, green gravity. And that's what I'd love to get into. So with this untapped opportunity, you started Green Gravity. I guess from your side, what is that 30-second pitch of what green gravity does?
Well, green gravity, as its name suggests, is in the renewable energy space. And our objective is to help renewables become integrated and lower their cost to make them integrated into our electricity grid. And part of doing that means that we need to store the energy. We need to store it when it's produced to use it later. And so green gravity is an energy storage technology that uses the gravitational force to lift heavy objects up using renewable energy, and that consumes the energy and essentially turns it into potential energy. And then we lower those objects back down again later to release energy back to the grid. The unique part of our technology is that we do this via repurposing a legacy mine shaft. Meaning that we're able to use the legacy mining asset directly for the purpose of storing renewable energy. It's a mechanical battery. And so we take the mine shaft, we're lifting heavy objects up the mine shaft when there's surplus renewables, and then we're lowering them back down again the mine shaft when we want to release that energy back to the grid. So it's a really simple example of using gravity for great effect to store energy, and at the same time taking that redundant asset and making it do work again for the energy transition. And so that's what green gravity does.
I mean, when I first heard of the idea, I was reminded of my high school physics textbook and the explanation of potential energy. You know, when you lift something and if it's sitting on top of something, it has more energy stored in it than if it was on the ground where you were standing.
It does. In the early times, I used to often get the question, but, so, okay, we're consuming energy and then we place it back again later and we've lifted them and lowered the blocks. Where's the energy been stored? It's the question people ask me. Do you need a chemical battery? And that question misses this actually quite simple point that you ultimately get back to, which is it's been stored as potential energy of the mass. We need no chemicals. And when people kind of they hear that again, they go, now I get it. It's actually really simple. And in its own way, a really elegant reuse of infrastructure to be able to simply exchange the potential energy backwards and forwards. And we can do it forever. We can lift it, lower it, and it doesn't degrade, it doesn't leak, it doesn't require us to replenish it. So it's a wonderful renewable resource.
No, indeed. Well, once you get your head around the concept itself, and I guess to really come full circle with how that energy is retrieved from the storage or released, as you're lowering it down the mine shaft, I guess it is driving some kind of generator to...
It's driving a regenerative electrical motor, which is the other part of the technology. So we take the concept of a grandfather clock or a pumped hydro scheme, which would sort of do the same thing, lift mass up for potential energy and let it release. We take that really basic old school concept, we apply it to the legacy mine shaft, which has huge depth, so we get huge amount of energy, and then we bring it together with one of the world's most advanced technologies, being a regenerative electrical motor, which you find in an electric vehicle. And if anyone drives an electric vehicle, if you take your foot off the accelerator, the motor wants to brake. It wants to stop the car. And what's that really doing? It's called regenerative braking. And we use that same motor type in what we do. So as we lower the block down the mine shaft, we let the motor do the braking of the descent. And in doing that, we don't have to put a mechanical brake on and lose all the energy. We let the electric motor convert that energy back into electrons, which is what's happening in your car. When you brake your Tesla, you're actually charging the battery again. Well, we do the same thing with our mass as it moves down the mine shaft. It generates electricity and sends it back to the grid as our generation. And so we're just using the same principles.
Fascinating indeed. And to think that, electrical motors or regenerative electrical motors can be used not just in EVs, but also in things like this.
Yeah.
And you start to look at, one technology, multiple functions. And I think that's, what we need to think more about in the world.
Well, exactly. And reuse. I think there's a real theme here around we are able to reuse the shaft. We're able to reuse a lot of the connection infrastructure. And so this is an opportunity to reduce resource consumption because we're reusing stuff we already extracted and made good from. So
indeed,
that's an additional theme in addition to how do we make technologies do more for us, like the regenerative motors here.
And the weights themselves, they're like, I guess if I have to visualize it, it's like giant metal drums or something.
Yeah, they're like a hockey puck. We sometimes talk about the giant hockey puck.
A giant hockey puck. Okay.
Giant hockey puck. They're pretty big. They're as big as your car, and they weigh a lot. Wow. Yeah, so they're sort of like this big hockey puck on steroids. And they're designed very, very specifically to achieve a number of functions. One is they want to be really heavy, so they've got very high density. 2, they want to be really low cost. 3, they want to be really low carbon. 4, they have a lot of mechanical needs. So mechanical forces are going on these objects because we move them down at some level of speed and we move them up, so they're getting in this tension that means they've got to handle that. And then we proceed to stack these objects on top of each other. And so they also have a lot of compressive forces. So they've got the whole range of forces, and then we need to do that at low cost and very, with long life. So they're really a lot of technology in those objects, despite how simple they sound.
I've just got this image of, someone taking a bunch of little button batteries and sort of stacking them on top of each other. And I guess it would be similar. And you'd be doing this down a mine shaft at a much larger scale.
Correct. Exactly right. And we have to do that autonomously because, of course, we can't afford to put anyone in harm's way. So one of the design criteria in our technology is that we don't put anybody underground. And so that means, it means wonderful that we don't put anyone in harm's way, so we can't hurt anybody. 2, it means we can use a very large number of mine shafts because we don't need to worry so much about the condition of the shaft as you would if you were putting people down there. But, of course, the downside is you have to do things at huge distances underground remotely with not being able to see it and so forth. So there's a lot of robotics that are layering into the technology. There's a lot of precision engineering around the control, coordination and control of the technology as well.
No, that's an incredible feat to be able to then also automate as well.
Yeah.
And if you can do that, as you mentioned, then you're kind of the only constraint you have for a location choice is how close to the grid it is so that you can put the energy into the grid.
Yeah, that's right. And what's fascinating, Peter, is we kind of learned that many of the mine shafts, in fact, around in excess of 90% of the shafts we've currently examined still have the grid connected to the mine. And this, in many cases, the grid was actually built for the mines. And so it was rolled out when they said there's a huge mine. They built the grid there because there was no other way to do the mining. Yeah. That for many, many years, the ability to have a remote power generating system was fanciful at the kind of sizes we're talking about. And so big mine shafts use big power. And so they have really robust electricity grid. And usually when they close the mine, what we found is that they just turn the substation off and walk away. And so there are huge numbers of electrical substations sitting idle across our countries. At a time when we're worried about getting connections to grids all over the place, there's actually all these idle ones there.
Yeah, and I guess sometimes it costs a lot more to decommission that entire infrastructure than just leaving it there to, I guess, for lack of a better word, to rot away.
Yeah. And in many cases, we see that holders of mines, and that can be in many cases governments, private organisations, can be mining companies, whoever, they employ a concept called care and maintenance, which is they cease operations for a site but don't move it into a full closure. And as a result, they do some basic maintenance on the equipment and just hold it in that state for an extended period with the potential that the mine may start in the future. And the majority of the time, that isn't the case, that those mines don't restart. But they're a really interesting example of these assets that are actually in decent condition. They're in good locations, but are not really doing the work that they could be.
And I guess just to visualize the scale of this, so we know these giant hockey pucks, we know they weigh a lot and we know how the system sort of works, but like how deep are we lowering these pucks into the mine shaft?
Yeah. Let's contextualize it. I'm not sure what the tallest building in Switzerland is, but it's no doubt tall. The Centrepoint Tower in Sydney, it's 303 metres tall. And the average mine shaft that we're working with is 600 metres deep.
Oh, wow.
Twice as deep as the tallest building in Australia is tall.
Jeez. And
so we're talking about a really very large holes in the ground that they've been operating as a mine. They're deep and they're very big holes. They're, in some cases 7, 8, 9 meters in diameter, which is just enormous.
That is a whole different scale to think about.
Yeah. So you could think about, your house can kind of fit down into the hole and it can go down twice as deep as the tallest building in Australia. And that's average shaft we're dealing with. And we're dealing with shafts that are twice as deep as that again. So 1,200 meters is not an uncommon shaft for us to be considering for commercial deployment.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It's usually we think in terms of heights, but then I guess the the depth, it makes you remember all these, stories you hear of the old mining days where the workers went down into the shaft, and the claustrophobia of it just gives me a bit of the chills.
The claustrophobia back in the day would have been amazing. We've been very extensively working in India for the last 2 or 3 years, and we've built lots of relationships and understanding of the mining market. And there's this amazing site in the southern end of India called the Kolar Goldfields. They ceased operations about 20 years ago. The final operations ceased. But this is one of the most magnificent mines ever constructed in that it ran for hundreds of years, 300 to 400 years this mine ran for. It was the jewel of the British Empire in its day, and it generated, the majority of the world's gold resource at a certain point in time. And so these sorts of sites have got all this history and amazing. This site goes down 3,000 meters.
Wow.
And it was manually operated. People were climbing down back in the day, hundreds of years ago, and has all of these kind of, mining areas that spin off from it. But you can imagine what it was like down the bottom. And we understand that, it was very hot down there. And so they had thousands of people in their workforce that would go down for whole days on an end and end up coming back. So there's these wonderful stories we hear about these sites.
3,000 meters. That's like how much I do on a treadmill for a light jog in half an hour. No, that's insane. Just to think that you can drill that deep, casually to then set up your mining operation. But as someone who's not as familiar with with the mining world and only just getting into it slowly, it always blows my mind to hear all these numbers and to really get a sense of it. And I guess we've covered depths of mine. We've covered the technology itself. We've covered the way it kind of works, which is incredibly fascinating. And one thing, I guess, to clarify also the energy storage aspect. I mean, it's long-term energy storage. So in a way, you're trying to also bridge sort of periods of lack in energy supply. And this is a very good way of doing that.
It's a really, really important area of the energy transition where we've kind of got this. We've got a grid today around the world that's kind of mostly backed by coal and gas, and so they're very base. They can respond accordingly, and they're kind of stable fuels.
Yeah,
but they've got all these carbon emissions that we've got to deal with, and we've got to turn those fuels off. And the answer is we're adding in fuels that are based off wind and solar, and they produce when they produce. The solar only produces in the day. The wind produces when it's windy, and so you're taking away a stable fuel source and replacing it with a variable fuel source, meaning that you've got these variability patterns that are increasingly hitting the grid. And the only way to stabilize the demand and the supply correctly is by adding storage assets. And you're right to point out the different kinds of storage assets are going to be needed and are needed. And where we start the journey and through till today is that we need broadly quite short periods of time to bridge the variability, because there's still heaps of coal and gas in every grid, no matter where you are. And so you've got this 1 or 2 hours where you might need a huge peak of demand of electricity in the evening time. So you have a 1 or 2 hour battery. The lithium batteries are perfect for this. You take a bit of solar in the middle of the day and you put it out in the evening. The thing is, as we move forward in the transition, that problem isn't going to be the real problem we're facing. It's an issue. It's got to still be managed and grown against. But the bigger problem starts to be if we take out our coal and gas, the electricity system still needs to run all night.
That's true.
And there is zero solar at night, and always will be.
Yep.
And so there's some wind, but actually solar is half the cost of wind. So progressively it's going to be more and more solar built, and there is none at night. And so you're going to increasingly need not to deal with the 1 or 2 hour peak in the evenings. You're going to need to deal with all night. You need 12 hours of proper dispatchable generation, and that's got to come from somewhere. And that means that what we need is a fleet of assets that are called long-duration storage that can deal with that, nighttime, and then the variability that happens from week to week or month to month, which has also got to be buffered. And that's what we're working on. That's our technology.
We often think about, energy generation, where to get it from renewable sources, but what we tend to forget is, you have to store it somehow.
Yeah, and you can't store electrons. This is the thing I never realized. You can't actually store electricity directly. This is the craziest thing of all. If you've got a production of milk from your cow, you can put it in a bucket and store it and then drink it later. Electricity can't be stored directly. And that is a huge problem, meaning you've got no choice but to find other ways. You've got to convert it to something else. And that's one of the dilemmas of energy storage.
I think that maybe that's why I went into water, because water you can see when you're storing it, whereas electricity wasn't. a bit more esoteric for me.
Yeah, that's true.
No, but it's been quite a few years since you started Green Gravity, and you've been building up a lot of partnerships. You have partnerships in Romania, in Germany, in India, in Australia, obviously where you're based, but also with some very important and big mining companies as well. And I guess where you're at now is you've got facilities or infrastructures that can store up to 10 gigawatt hours of storage, as far as I've understood the stats.
Yeah, that's certainly, you're right. In relation to our partnerships, we've taken the concept of partnership really seriously since the inception of the organisation. And what we realised is that the problem that we're trying to lean into is so enormous. There's 50 billion tonne a year of emissions going on out there, and there needs to be a lot done to kind of drop that down. And so we're leaning into this enormous problem. And as a small company, no matter how big we get, we'll still be small relative to that. And so we need force multipliers. We're not going to be able to do everything ourselves. So working in partnership just makes a lot of sense. And so we've taken that philosophy since the beginning, and that's with big potential customers, that's with big suppliers. It's, in every way we can think about how do we partner to increase our effect. That's has given us the option to build a quick pipeline. And so we're still bringing the technology to final conclusion. We're about 2/3 of the way through the technical development so that to full commercial scale. And that will be, I think, ready next year. And so what we've been able to do is concurrently with bringing that technology to full readiness, we have been working with key prospective customers, site holders and so forth to get the commercial readiness moving. And on that, the first part of that is how do we get enough of the right sites lined up and ready to go? And we've got around about 10 gigawatt hours of potential sites kind of sitting there going through the right levels of study, the right preparedness, so that when the tech is ready next year, we can start the journey of building out that pipeline of development. And then, at the same time, grow that pipeline and start to scale the business even more so that we can have a genuine impact on the transition.
10 gigawatt hours. I mean, I was Googling to see what kind of order of magnitude that is, and that is enough to power a large city for an entire year.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So we are aiming big. And we want to try and take a technology that, and I described to the team recently, if we look at the opportunity with gravitational energy storage, and we've got to complete that development and get that right, there's an engineering challenge in that, but it's not going to Mars. It's not of that same ilk of challenge. We've got to go and do the right work. But if we look upstream and downstream of our organisation, if we look downstream of our organisation to what's the demand profile, the demand profile is effectively unlimited. There is multiple $1 trillion worth of investment required in global energy storage to firm the grid over the next 25 years. So there's this enormous growth rate. There's 400 times growth in the market coming down the pipeline. So there's not a constraint on us. On the upstream, which is finding the right natural assets to deploy this technology, we conservatively think there's more than 2 million sites globally that could house the technology. And so, we couldn't possibly commercialize all of those. There's effectively an unlimited number of sites upstream of us. So we're left with a fascinating world where we're unlimited on most parts of our business, and we've got to go find how to take that and now drive maximum impact from it. And that's really about how fast can we work, how effective can we be about bringing kind of the solution to the problem. And that's how we're looking at it.
And, the multiple benefits of it too. So I'm just thinking alternative storage tech, like you mentioned lithium-ion batteries. I think they're probably good for very small scale stuff. But if you're trying to build something at this same scale, that's a lot of material usage and probably not as sustainable as well.
I think we're going to have to society's going to have to direct resources to the highest beneficial use. We're going to have to reuse more resources more cleverly, and we're going to have to reduce consumption in a smart, efficient way so that we can kind of reduce the size of the problem, direct the solutions efficiently, and reuse what we can. And so I think there's a range of technologies out there. Lithium ion's a great technology, as you say, for many applications. It's going to grow as fast as it can and scale, but it's going to be needed. It's needed in electric vehicles. It's needed in short duration energy storage. It's needed in so many applications. It's needed in consumer. My phone needs it.
Yeah, that's true.
We got to be careful about making sure it's, we don't try to do everything all at once. There are other technologies that I think are more economically efficient, that are more ecologically efficient for the long duration applications it's a different profile. And so I think we fit in there in a complementary way with those technologies. And the market's growing fast, the technologies are coming through, and I think there's a lot of need for all of these technologies to deploy as fast as possible to help tackle this emissions that's really going to come down as fast as we can.
Definitely. And another benefit in the list of multiple benefits is, I guess, deferred remediation. So you're kind of using that mine shaft for something.
Yep.
And therefore that also offsets a lot of the headaches. Maybe you might have to do minimal work.
That's right. Well, and this is the thing. We're genuinely using it. It's not a play to kind of get out of something and that. What we actually do is we bring the fundamentals of the tech, which is we need great height, and we bring that to this asset, and therefore we're liberating value on the asset. We're making money into the market there, which actually brings more resources to remediate other parts of those things faster. Mm-hmm. So there's this huge societal benefit, there's economic benefit that's drawn in by taking now what is a new technology and taking those sites and repurposing them with it. And that's something we're getting a lot of positive attention from regulators and the communities around is this actually just makes sense. The other really important bit that comes along with these sorts of benefits is jobs.
True.
And that's getting the attention of many stakeholders and in several locations where it's actually quite self-evident that our project needs a construction workforce. We then need a maintenance workforce. We need a manufacturing workforce to produce the componentry. And those jobs are real. They're proper, hardcore manufacturing types of jobs and construction jobs, and they're local. And so when we come to a region, and I can mention regions like the Jiu Valley in Romania, where we're working with key parties from the Romanian government down to advance potential deployment of this technology into regions that are seeing job losses associated with turning carbon fuels off. And we want to be able to layer jobs on, and we can do that in a complementary fashion. The same in Australia. I mean, we are working very publicly in Mount Isa in central Queensland, and one of the reasons that we're there is that our tech can bring jobs to that region that is seeing jobs come down as mining transitions to closure in some cases. So this is really interesting local community benefit that means that we've got not just an energy benefit, not just a remediation environmental benefit, a resource and strategic resource allocation benefit, a national security benefit where, we're changing the supply chain resilience needs, but we're also producing local jobs for people and helping them transition as the carbon economy changes and comes down and the green economy comes up.
And something that is scalable too, because even though sites may be different, the technology can be trained
very
upon.
Modular.
And
correct, exactly. We're working very, very hard to make it as modular as we can so that we can ultimately deploy that to very wide regions across continents and say, here's how it works. We can digitally design. We're very advanced on the digital design dimensions, the digital modeling, and how we bring the tech to life. And then we can produce the components and get them to location for the local community to take advantage of. That's where we want to be.
Fantastic. And so out of all the different pathways you've sort of illustrated, what are you most excited about going forward for Green Gravity in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
I'm actually very excited about the jobs. That's what we've seen is pulling this technology in. And so us being able to bring it to life and then move it to a scaling point where it goes beyond Green Gravity's need to control this, but it goes to a point where this technology can be really scaled up and have an impact across the energy system, because I really think we are going to face significant challenges in the energy transition in the next 10 to 15 years as we deploy more and more renewables rightly, but the negative effects of those renewables actually starts to amplify because of the variability in the system, the difficulty in integrating them beyond the lower levels that we've seen so far. So being able to see us be part of that solution and there to be an ability to solve multiple problems at the same time through the reuse and those jobs, that's the bit that really excites me. And so it's a big job for us to get on with our role in that, which is as a technology developer to get it ready and get it going. And then there's going to be so many others that play roles in it, but that's our job and we've got to do that right and quick.
And I look forward to observing how you progress in the next few years. And of course, we'll be in touch. But at some point, if I'm in Australia, I should drop by Wollongong.
Well, please do. We would love to host you in Wollongong. We've got test facilities. We've got lovely beaches as well, Peter, that Switzerland sort of struggles with beautiful beaches, of course. We've got lovely lakes and everything else. But, there's a great opportunity to host you here in Wollongong. And you can see some legacy mines and mine shafts right in town. In Wollongong, there's dozens upon dozens of legacy coal mines right around the urban area.
That's something that I didn't realize until I actually did the analysis together with Mohan, that a lot of these legacy sites are also embedded in urban areas, maybe because also the urban areas expanded beyond there. But
Well, yes, but I mean, funny story. When we first started the company, one of the things I realised from your analysis was there's certain areas within Australia that have an unusual concentration of old abandoned mines. One of those happens to be in central Victoria at a place called Ballarat. And Ballarat, actually back in its day, in the heyday of the gold rush in the 1800s, Ballarat was crowned the richest city in the world.
Oh, wow.
And I was fascinated, and it was a real gold rush town. And it turns out that, of course, this enormous gold deposits were under the area. The town was built because the mines were there. And so they built the mines and built the town. And so this is all intermingled.
Yeah.
And when you visit there, we went and spent some time to understand what does the mining infrastructure look like. It's very old, and so it's not the ideal place where we would start Green Gravity's deployments because, they are older sites. But I believe that our tech will be ready for those sites at some point soon, and then it's an amazing opportunity. There are so many mine shafts around the suburbs that they're in under streets. Houses are built on top of them. And we met at one time there with an old mining engineer who'd retired, and he came to this cafe and he rolled out all these old maps, these wonderful old hand-drawn maps of mines. And we wanted to understand how the shafts work and everything. And he said, sitting in his cafe, and he looks across the road and he says, you see that car parked over there? I said, yeah. He says, there's a mine shaft underneath that car.
Oh.
And he said, he points down the other end of the street. He goes, see the corner over there? He said, there's another mine shaft there.
Oh, wow.
And he said, there's a house over the other side of the street. It's got one in the backyard. And he had capped some of them, and they were everywhere. And these were big shafts. They were 500 metres, 1,000 metre deep type of shafts, and they were all through the area. And a lot of them had just big caps on them, and some of them had multiple concrete caps to enable infrastructure to be built over the top. But yeah, there's a really interesting area. We heard a story about an old pub in Ballarat that had a mine shaft underneath the pub that came up under the pub. And the miners had cleverly built a main shaft. They'd built an auxiliary shaft that came in onto the basement of the pub with ladders. And so that they'd mid-shift, they'd vanish from their work, climb the ladder into the pub, have a few beers, and then climb back into it. So this apparently existed for decades, this secret mine shaft that went up into the basement of the pub.
Oh, that's so cool. Is the pub aptly named?
Yeah, I can't remember, but I'm sure it must have been.
Oh, I'm sure we'll find it if we went looking for it in Ballarat.
Exactly.
It's been a long time since I was there. I was there as a child. I visited it. Yes, the gold mining. That's what I remember from Ballarat. I guess that's really the iconic aspect.
They're really branded around it. Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's fascinating stories. But I guess it really does illustrate, sometimes cities are built for that very purpose, and then they thrive beyond that because the industries change, things evolve over time, and what once was core business becomes something of the past.
Exactly. I actually think there are hundreds of regions around the world that have got this kind of legacy around them, that they had something really linked to the mining sector that have, in many cases, either have or will, they'll move on from that. And there's this huge transition. And they're left with this legacy that I think can flourish, and that there's a future, something for the next century can actually be built on that legacy. And so there's many communities that I think this technology is really specifically going to work beautifully for.
And I think it's great that we are starting to look back on that legacy and to think about, what's its story going forward? What's its sustainability going forward as well, especially also with new sites as well. So
yes.
No, definitely.
Yeah, we think there's and the New South Wales government in Australia has been very proactive in recent times around thinking about post-mining land use, and recently brought down an inquiry, was only published weeks ago, into post-mining land use and what the government may be able to do to structurally support the transition of mines. And there are many really interesting areas, and gravitational storage is obviously a critical one, but they point to the ability to generate those jobs and to convert the legacy that was embedded from these mining into a really productive part of the future economy.
And that's great to see that, there's an active push as well from government at the top level. I think sometimes you need action at all levels of decision making, and in a way that incentivizes people to then take action as well.
I agree.
Yeah. But I guess one big overarching theme as well is really your decision to go from a pretty big role at BHP to starting your own company. And taking that step is often a very difficult and long decision. And I guess it really forces you to also look back at what you want to achieve as well, what is important for you. I certainly just took that step recently by starting my own company.
Congratulations on that too.
Thank you very much. And so I guess that is it's also reflective of how business around the world is changing. And that's something I'd be curious to hear about what your opinions are about that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I started in the 90s at the steel mill, the context was it's a job for life, effectively. You enter sort of a big industrial business, that's sort of the way it is, and that's your career. And I feel like in the last generation, this last 20 years, the world's completely shifted. Certainly in the Australian context, the world has shifted in this such that people aren't getting a job for life now, and they're looking to understand how to build a career, and the relationship between people and employers has fundamentally changed. And I think it's changing progressively. And what we're seeing something to now is increasing importance people are placing on mission of company and purpose and outcome, and what's driving the company and what impact can they have as a participant in that company. And I was very pleased with my relationship at BHP, for example, and with the mission that they had and how I could contribute. But saying that, I also felt that I could do more. And in watching the climate transition and the fact that it's not progressing at the speed, the decarbonisation is not progressing at the speed that you would want to see it at, I felt that there was only one answer, which is that I could complain about that or I could go and do more directly. So I took that decision to say, well, I might as well, rather than just sit my time out in a big business, I'm going to go change my career up and do something completely different and really try and spend the rest of my career increasing the impact that I can have. And I feel like that what we've tapped into is also a giant theme where people, wherever they are in their career path, there is an increasing desire to have direct impact. And so companies like ours and our competitors and others in the sector, I think, are able to offer something that is very attractive to talent out there. And that's really important going forward. And so we're seeing that. We're attracting an absolutely amazing team, I think partly because of what we're trying to achieve.
I think there's been also a lot of changes in the world around how business is done, the digital economy, but also just the fact that we have social media. Just coming back to the very start of the episode where you talked about the importance of, I guess, seeing people and making that genuine connection. It feels like, when we hear the keyword personal brand is starting to become a much more important thing. And it makes me feel like we're moving away from large corporations down to a more, I guess, artisanal, back to the old small business kind of era. But I feel like not quite. I think there are
big shifts in this. There's a balance, but I've really, really noticed, especially since we started Green Gravity, and I come from a big business background, I've been amazed at some of the things we've been able to do that I don't think 10 years ago small companies could do. Like our IT systems are as good or better than any multinational company's IT systems. Yeah. And that's because the world of software as a service evolved in the last decade, and it now provides tier one services without having to build a data center and commission some giant system. You can access best of breed technology at any scale of business and do it really cheaply. That's one example. Another example is this trend to working from home and from remote work. It breaks down the need for concentrated investment in office space and everything else and lets people be more democratized around where they're working. So the labor force can spread more, the technology base and ability to conduct business at a sensible cost at a super professional level, those are all changing. And you layer now in what's going on in AI, which is moving month by month in terms of how fast this is moving. And the power it is giving to small companies to do stuff that only a big company could ever have done in the past. It's remarkable. And so again, I think that's improving the competitiveness of smaller companies. And there's one thing small companies have over big companies and always have had and still do have, which is they can be much more innovative. They can be much more innovative because it's just not the inertia of controlling risk that a big company has to have. And so accordingly, what you're getting is, I think, a lot of value flowing into smaller companies that are able to deliver greater productivity, they're able to deliver greater innovation in this really interesting world. And I think the labour force and people at large are starting to see this. And I'm seeing there's more of a willingness for younger people or for mid-career people to take a risk on a small company than they would have in the past. And that the value proposition from a small company can be just as good. And so it's really, I'll give you an example of something, Peter, which I found fascinating. We've recently provided to our workforce the option for a vehicle as a service, electric vehicle as a service platform for their personal vehicles.
Oh, interesting.
And extremely cost competitive. You can access an EV with little lock-in risk, and it's for personal use. You pay out of your payroll and you can get an electric vehicle as your company vehicle. Now, that is something a small business never would have offered 10 years ago. They didn't have electric vehicles then, but have any. But we're able to make offerings that are the equivalent of what large companies would only be able to offer in the past as an employee value proposition. Now anyone can offer it. And so this is breaking down the competitive barriers between small and large business.
And I guess enabling that. And, with the small businesses, not, as you mentioned, having to move large inertia and taking, decisions that don't just completely cascade into disasters if they go wrong, it makes them a lot more flexible. Coming with that, a lot of young people wanting to start startups. I guess some of the issues is that we look at the stats, 90% of startups fail. Of course, you can always try again. But, you're someone who's built up so much rich knowledge around business, doing business, the cultural aspects as well, the global aspects, and just experience. I mean, what advice can you then offer to the younger people wanting to build their own startups who may not have that experience?
Yeah. So experience, no individual's ever going to have all the experience they need. I mean, so people that have had more time in business will have accumulated more themselves, but they're still not going to have everything. It's the nature of an organization. It's the nature of teams in that you got to recognize that even if you've got a certain sort of limited set of skills because you're young and haven't had a lot of opportunity across the breadth, there's people probably right next to you that have. And so this concept of partnership and reaching out and looking for the support network is increasingly important for, say, a young person starting a business in an innovative space. And what I've seen is the infrastructure to enable that and support that is growing rapidly in most parts of the world. And so there's incubators, there's startup mentoring networks, there's government schemes to support startups that are there really to bridge those gaps. They're maybe there for a bit of funding. They're only nominal funding most of the time in that stuff. But it's how do I access someone who knows how to do marketing? How do I do someone who knows how to set up an IT system? Those things are platforms that are now accessible through the local university, which there may be an incubator near there, or from your state, local government, capital city is going to have incubators. And that's where you got to start. Don't hesitate to reach out. I didn't know much about them when I started Green Gravity, and I was lucky because I had this experience. But in hindsight, we could have used those support services probably a little bit more effectively. But if you're starting a company, start there. That's what I think. You can bridge a lot of risks straight away.
Yeah, and even if there's none available locally, I guess geography has also not become an issue anymore.
Correct.
With the digital world.
Exactly. It wouldn't surprise me if there's whole businesses that have never met in person. Our team's been very dynamic from the beginning. We're very open to flexibility, and that's meant that we've been able to move really effectively and get the best talent because people want what they want.
Yeah.
And so if you're able to offer that flexibility and bring them in, it's a huge advantage.
Definitely. And I think this increasing self-awareness and increasing wanting to make a difference in the world, that's been the biggest shift. And it'll be interesting to see how that now continues into the future.
Yes.
But a very, very fascinating story so far, Mark. It's been incredible just learning about your journey and just learning more about Green Gravity as well. And going into, giving advice to young people, I'd love to ask you more questions that I usually ask so that my listeners can learn even more about how you think and what are some of your, as we said, values. I guess relating to that, innovation sits at the core of a lot of the things we discussed. And so in your view, what does the word innovation truly mean, and how has it shaped the way you approach challenges and opportunities in your work?
We think about it in terms of inquisitiveness. And so I've thought a lot about this actually when we really designed the culture of Green Gravity, and it's a very deliberate design. We stepped through a build of a culture, and one of the core tenets of that is around this question around how do we drive innovation and maintain that innovative drive. And saying you want to be innovative is nice, but doesn't achieve a lot. The question is, what is innovation and how do you embed that in? And one of those elements that we spend a lot of time on is inquisitiveness, and that it's a core feature of how people are innovative is that they keep asking why, and they keep wanting to understand the problem or understand potential solutions. And if that's their natural behavior, they'll stumble across innovative outcomes because they're continually inquisitive about why and what's going on and how do we do this. And so that's one dimension. Another dimension of innovation, I think, is pragmatism. That you can't always wait for a 100% solution, because getting through as yet unknown solution, which is where you're going in innovation, you're at a frontier, is that you've got to kind of say that's good enough for the moment. We're going to move on and now move to the next part of the problem so that you're compiling something that actually moves forward. Otherwise, you just stay in a loop potentially forever in these unknown spaces. So you've got to have this pragmatic view where I'm going to cut and move to the next thing, and it's good enough for the moment. And that can be hard for people, very hard for people. So there's two of the elements that we tend to look at. Another that I do want to mention, of course, is tenacity. That, being innovative means you've got to stare into something that looks like it can't be solved, or that people will tell you it can't be solved. And you've got to make some sort of judgment that I want to stay at the course. I'm going to continue to take a few knocks and to be told no, or push through this mental barrier that occurs that you could give up at. This looks like this is too hard. And having the tenacity to push through that barrier and keep going is really important to innovation, because that's, in many cases, you'll find some solution that sits there that you just couldn't expect. And so those are a few dimensions that we think of with innovation.
Incredible. I mean, inquisitiveness, pragmatism, tenacity, knowing how deep to go, knowing when to stop, and knowing not to give up.
Yes. There you go. Exactly.
Yeah, incredible. Was there a key moment, book, event, person that completely changed the course of your career or mindset?
There's many. I actually think stories of outcomes that can be accumulated by a sequential series of interactions and people that change the course of a direction. And I reflect on green gravity rather than sort of further back than that, and sort of reflect on there are key people through our journey that have made us successful for where we are today, and without which we would have really struggled, or we'd be in a very different place. And those are people that they come and they go, they might stick, and they have their own reason for doing something, but they fundamentally change things. They come in and they believe in what we're doing and offer a certain type of support that completely shifts their ability to do something. And then they may have done it for their own reasons. And that might be funders, that might be business partners that have come in with a business to help you achieve a certain issue, that they lean in a way that you wouldn't have expected, but that have fundamentally changed the outcome. It's those individuals that I reflect on and go, wow, actually the story of a success is a story of lots and lots of individuals that played a certain part. And they may or may not be core to where that company was, but they were core to what was happening at the time. And so I feel like it's a really interesting observation I've made about green gravity's history. It's all about people.
It's actually very interesting when you think about, you think back to your journey and you look at the sequence of events. I think that's a key word that, struck a chord with me. And it's like, if any one element had been not in that same sequence, the outcome would have been completely different.
Yeah, exactly right. Someone said to me at one point that there's never been two chess games played the same. Which is quite remarkable, because that can't possibly be true. But if you do the maths, the number of combinations to get to an end of a chess game, there's just never been two played the same, statistically, most likely. And you go, it's kind of profound in that, okay, so we get to a certain place in a business in this scenario. Actually, there's all of these individual bilateral items that have happened, like this bouncing ball that's gone through, and each one of them is actually directed to another, such that there's this one unique pathway that got us to here. And as you say, if you hadn't have had that conversation or had a different conversation, it would have gone off in a different direction. And I feel like that's very much like a chess game here, is that the successful companies have navigated in a unique fashion, and can't actually, people, green gravity is such a simple technology. And so you must be devastatingly worried about someone chasing you down and eating your lunch and just overtaking you. And my response is, no, I'm not devastatingly worried about that. That doesn't mean I'm not respectful of competitors and, we have to go deliver and do the right work to succeed. But the journey that we've been on has so many embedded learnings within it that the intellectual property of our team and of our technology, but more importantly, our team, I think, it's unique. And I don't see someone else suddenly replicating that, access to these types of people or ability to think about a problem in that way and whatever. No matter how big and powerful the company, I think they'd struggle to follow our path as we would struggle to follow someone else's path.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice way of looking at it, because, it's not just about the end product, but it's everything that went into it and what you've learned from it. And either way, they say that, copying is the greatest form of flattery. So
that's right.
But no, it's fascinating reflecting on it, just hearing you thinking about my own journeys as well, and that non-linear path and that very unique path as well, and what it's sort of given you as embedded learnings, as you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to just go back quickly on this tenacity, but not in this context of the innovation, but more broadly, the staying power that people need in the innovative environment, in the small business environment, if they want to make a big difference, is the reserve, the interior reserve to continue to push through and to stay in the game. Because you can't predict where the bouncing ball's fully going to go. You can plan and you can be ready, you can build capability and do the right things. And by and large, you do that, you're going to make your own luck. But ultimately, you don't really know where tomorrow is going. And if you don't make it to tomorrow, you're not going to know whether actually suddenly you got some, sometimes you have bad luck, sometimes you have good luck along a journey. Being there tomorrow actually makes a huge difference, because sooner or later, if you're doing all the right things, you will get the outcome. And I reflect on that actually finding ways to dig deep and staying power through problems, through challenges, etc. People respect it. And the more time you're there, the more progress you make, the more seriously companies and technologies are taken, actually. And that I think is a really important message for people that are getting into an innovative space with a great idea. Be ready to have staying power, because it's that is half the secret and half the outcome.
Oh, incredible advice. I think that's, coming back to that tenacity, that grit to then really believe in what you do and to forge on, I guess, despite any resistance you might encounter or challenges, because that's just part of the day-to-day.
Yeah, it's like we have sometimes play in a poker team, a poker group, and we conclude the night by we up the amount of bets you have to make through the night to get the game finished at some sensible time. And I often reflect, and if you get towards the end of that game, if you still have chips, anyone can win, because suddenly the bets become big and it becomes almost random. But if you don't get to that last period of time, you have 0% chance of winning. And so this staying power to stay through, because you don't know where you get to. You might win even if it doesn't look like you will. And so it's important mindset around not giving up.
That's a very good visual for people to think about that concept. Thanks for providing that. And so staying power, building that, as well as, just forging on with innovative ideas demands a lot of good time management, especially if you want to balance your professional and personal time. So what tips and strategies can you offer for that to our listeners?
Quite a lot. Early in career, there was a series of years where there was great investments made by my employer at the time around efficiency and productivity for the individual. Productivity in an organisation starts with the productivity of the individuals. And if they're productive, then they'll be able to drive greater outcomes. And as a collective, you can drive greater outcomes. So I think it's a really, really important area to invest time and effort and discipline into. And so we were trained, I had training from how to best use technical tools to prioritize, through to reading all sorts of great books and getting training in how to run time management and how to delegate effectively and things. And so I bring to Green Gravity a real strong philosophy around personal effectiveness and productivity. And some of the very minor tips that I would have is, prioritization is really important, but you need to prioritize in a certain order. I mean, your time is your critical resource. And so allocating in with a disciplined fashion, allocating what you spend your time on is important. And little things happen that cause people to divert their time into someone else's priorities really quickly, like an email comes in or a phone call or whatever it might be. And suddenly what you said was your priority becomes not your priority. And that's the biggest productivity killer for an individual. So my single, if we're going down to one tip, my one tip is be very disciplined about your time allocation and allocate time to service other people's priorities, but allocate time to service your own priorities. And that will make you much more effective, because concurrent use of time, so multitasking, is materially less productive than single focus. And so try and increase the amount of single focus you have in your day and decrease the amount of multitasking, and you'll find it'll be remarkable how much productivity you'll gain.
Yeah, great advice. I'll definitely have to think about that and revisit my own time management after hearing that too. So thanks for offering that. What is your favorite childhood memory?
My favorite childhood memory, probably of my family were a Melbourne family, which is the very southern end of Australia, and so that all of our cousins and extended family lived down there. At a certain point, my family moved to Canberra, which is the nation's capital, and it's about an 8-hour drive north of Melbourne. And so we were kind of an outshoot of the family to the north. And when I was a child growing up, we used to do a routine road trip every school holidays down to Melbourne to visit with the family and stay with my grandmother and so forth. And those great memories of, the road trips to Melbourne and then spending, a couple of weeks on end at my nan's house, just, kicking around the yard or doing things with my grandma and in the yard and everything like that. So those are really cherished memories there around just being able to spend basic family time there on the road trips to Melbourne.
Definitely a long road trip. I mean, I remember driving from Melbourne to Sydney. That's a full day.
I feel sorry for Dad. It's a long road trip with kids in the back.
And I mean, you got a lot of hazards on the road you have to look out for when you're driving in Australia at times.
There's a lot of kangaroos and so forth. That's true. Those who believe that's a folklore, it's not. There's a lot of roos everywhere all over the roads.
And they are big. So
they are big.
Yeah, you got to be careful if you hit one.
Yeah, that's right.
You might still be okay, but your car won't be.
Yeah, that's true.
No, incredible. And yeah, I guess these periods where you get to then change environment as well and sort of revisit and visit family and extended family. I think there's a lot of people who remember those times very fondly. I certainly do.
And just to quickly connect back to what's going on in today's modern workplace, one of those big shifts has been the ability for people to work from home more, the ability for people to have a more flexible workplace, to do work. I think doing work at home can be very productive as long as you keep control of it. It doesn't, destroy your balance. But the ability to say, actually, I'm going to leave the office at 3:00 today. I'm going to pick up the kids from school and then I'm going to sort out some things after dinner on my computer. That world, I think it's actually got heaps of benefits. It's bringing people's ability to prioritise. If they want to create family time and experiences, then they can. Yeah. And they need not be sacrificing their career or their productivity at work from doing so. It's just a different way of doing things. That didn't exist back in the day and it does now. And I think that's a super good thing.
Yeah, I think it's given us a bit more agency over, being able to decide time, energy level, satisfaction. And when you're happy and when you're satisfied, you're also more productive as a result of it.
Definitely.
I certainly feel that way. What was one of the most challenging situations that you've ever faced in your career to date, and how did you overcome it?
I'd say during what Australians call the GFC, the global financial crisis, where there was a meltdown in the markets in 2009 that... 2008 maybe it was actually, where there was this traumatic financial outcome in the markets. And I had a really, a tight team, a big team that I was leading, and business conditions contracted and, there had to be some really tough decisions taken around layoffs and, dismantling roles in a team that you'd just spent a long time really bonding with the team and growing. And then to have to, in short order, make really tough decisions to lay people off that you knew it was going to have huge impact to them, who were great people that you had not done anything wrong, but have to go deliver that news and make those changes happen and be accountable for that. Gee, that was a really tough time and experience to have to go and about face on everything you'd been doing and deliver really hard news and hard outcomes for people. So, I relied a lot on mentors at that kind of time and keeping a positive spirit that, ultimately there are circumstances that are there, but that you've got a journey to try and do the right thing and that you've got a mission there and trying to stay true to that. So that was a really tough period that comes immediately to mind when you ask that question.
And I guess, having the responsibility over people, that's a very different kind of experience. People, they start a startup, they have these big ideas, but the minute they hire the first person, and this is what I've heard, not experienced yet, but probably will in future. The minute you hire your first person, you're responsible for them. And in a way, it takes a different load on you.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. You've got to remember that, and that they're putting a lot of trust in you, and so that adds an additional level of responsibility to what you're doing and motivation. I think it's quite a good thing about startups and smaller companies where the founders, they got to deliver. Yeah. There's a lot riding on it, more than the average kind of situation. So I think that motivates, and that's something investors want to see typically, is how well motivated are the founders, the founding group of an organisation. Well, there's a lot of strong motivations there.
Yeah, definitely. Incredible advice you've offered throughout the entire show today. And as we get close to wrapping up, I guess one final question amongst all the questions I ask is, what would you most like to be remembered for?
I think I often think about this in terms of I'd like to be remembered for having made an impact from what I've done, something that people could positively reflect on. And to say, well, you can do all these sorts of things, and then no one will ever kind of remember it really. So what is it that you've have an impact? You can have an impact on your kids. You can have, an impact on, hopefully even beyond that in the sense of, in my case, having an impact on changing the clean energy transition in its own ways, that people can say, well, there's an example of taking a risk and getting on and making a difference. They can emulate that in their own way, their own context at some other point in time. So if it can be remembered for having stimulated someone else to take a similar type of risk and find a solution and have the motivation for that, in addition to my own kids having a level of impact from whatever I've done, then I think that then I'd be very pleased with being remembered for that.
Well, if anything, you've certainly inspired me today on this show, and just generally as long as we've known each other. So I'm very thankful for that too. And
Thank
also
you,
for your time to coming onto the show and sharing your story. So where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
Well, they can always find us on my LinkedIn page. I'm active and I respond to people, whoever reaches out on LinkedIn. But certainly greengravity.com is a great place to start to see a bit more about our tech, what we're doing, what's the latest news. But follow us on LinkedIn. We're really keen on that. We want to build a viewership and a cohort of people that are following us, they've been inspired by what we're doing, and where appropriate, they're supporting us get on with our mission to kind of radically accelerate renewables.
Then we'll definitely put that as well as links to other topics we've discussed on today's show in the show notes so that listeners can then look it up and learn more about it. But Mark, thank you so much for coming onto the show. Like I do with every guest, I always give my guest the final message. So one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
My last message, Peter, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today, but my last message is you can make a difference yourself, and so don't hold back. What's stopping you? So take that journey, take that step. The support is there for you to go and make your own difference out there, so get on with it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that wraps up our insightful, educational and fascinating episode with Mark Swinnerton. For more information on the wonders of Wollongong, Australia, some tips on future business strategies, or just an overview of mining towns, grandfather clocks and hockey pucks, check out the show notes for more information over at petermbach.com/podcast. And as always, thank you listeners for tuning into this episode and for your feedback and support. If you're enjoying this show, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this podcast with your family, friends, colleagues, and even fellow underground explorers. Subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, other podcast channels, or follow the LinkedIn group to stay up to date with the latest releases. If you're curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to petermbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on X at Peter M. Bach or Instagram at petermbach87. Feel free to reach out to me with any feedback or guest suggestions so that I can keep improving this show. The podcast's intro and outro song is called Starsky by Alex Kieran. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.